If Modi and Xi are distancing themselves from Putin's war, does this tell you that perhaps this is the beginning of the end?
Well, you know what? I think that's a reasonable conclusion. If there were two people on the planet that Vladimir Putin did not want to get the cold shoulder from, or doesn't want to in general, it's Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi. And both of them, sort of each in their own way, as you said at the summit last week, were kind of cold to him in different ways. So, for example, Putin himself acknowledged openly to Xi that I know that you have questions, I know you have concerns. And if you look at the official documentation that Beijing put out after the conference, there is no more of this rhetoric about, friendship without limits, this type of talk that we saw that was happening, literally just days before the war. And then Modi, in some ways, is more interesting because he waited until the cameras were rolling. He waited until he was sitting across from Vladimir Putin, and he said to him directly, this is not an era of war. And there's some debate about, when you translate it from the Hindi, was it really that sharp of a comment? There's some chatter out there about that. But I think the more important point, what my sources are saying to me, is just the fact that he said it directly to him.
So the Look East policy and the No Limits partnership, it is being tested, but India and China, they're still quite happy to buy discounted Russian oil.
Yeah, they definitely are. I mean, look, they're getting a $20 to $30 break off Brent crude whenever they buy from Russia at a time when there's global inflation around energy prices. But there is also a shift in the calculus that has to take place. And by the way, it's being driven, and make no mistake about it, it's being driven by events on the battlefield. Nobody wants to line up behind a loser. And right now, Russia is in a steady retreat. And everything seems to point, in terms of materiel, in terms of organization, in terms of discipline, in terms of the number of troops, in Ukraine's favor. So now China and India are looking at some other factors. For example, cheap oil, is that nice for China? Sure it is. But Beijing also isn't all that thrilled with the way that their reputation is getting dragged through the mud, especially in Europe. The Germans, who have had China has been their largest trading partner for 6 consecutive years. Now they are saying openly, look, we got burned by being dependent on Russian oil. Let's not be dependent on Chinese trade. As a security matter, this is not the type of thing that Beijing wants to hear. And then for Modi, for his part, his concerns are, ironically, fuel security, not just for India, but for the entire emerging world, which he tries to be a spokesman for, right? And then food security, the cost of fertilizer. These things are on the other side of the ledger now, are beginning to stack up.
Mandy.
Yeah, and not just cheap Russian oil, but also in the case of India, arms, right? We were speaking with a guest yesterday, Ted, who was saying that there's a gap between the rhetoric of what India says, which is very pro-democracy, very pro-rule of law, and on the other hand, they continue to buy arms from Russia. So what do you think is behind this change of heart that we're seeing in Narendra Modi?
Well, I think that, Narendra Modi has his eye on his domestic audience, first and foremost. And he knows a good deal when he sees one. Russian oil is cheaper, as we were just discussing a moment ago. They get a break on it, despite not being party to this proposed fuel price cap that the Europeans and the Americans have recommended. And then, I haven't read into it closely, but probably there are Russian arms available on the cheap because it's becoming apparent that they aren't as effective as the weapons that the Ukrainians are using. So if you're an investor in the Raytheons or Lockheed Martin of the world, you basically have in this war a showcase for the superiority of these weapon systems. And so, will that change down the line, especially as India becomes more drawn into, not into the American orbit, because the Indians are really smart about not getting drawn into anybody's orbit too much. But will there be a change of heart as they, for example, become more directly involved with the Quad?
And the war in Ukraine is featuring very prominently on CNBC.com. We've got live updates, and that's one of the most closely watched stories on .com this morning. You've got an absurd situation where Russia is trying to start referendums in some of the Russian-held areas on Russian rule in the middle of a war. So we're watching that one. What else is trending?
Well, so that headline is trending well. That's one of the three big top stories right now among Asia-Pacific readers. You know, they're getting read into what happened in the U.S. markets overnight. We had a 1% drop off the major averages from the United States. And that, of course, was sparked by concern about what we're going to get today in terms of, you know, is it going to be a 3/4 point rate hike? And that, by the way, is the second biggest story on CNBC.com today. So people are very much engaged in looking at U.S. markets, looking at what's underlying the dynamics in U.S. markets right now, and then also, you know, just trying to keep a hand on the Ukraine war as things unfold there.
Exactly.